Okay, so I just reviewed the first two noble truths. Um, First one, suffering is related to some part of life, as if it should not be how it is. Second noble truth is that suffering originates in the belief that there's exactly one way that a particular part of life is, and that is the only way that it should be. And any other way shouldn't be. And then you get resentment and grief and shame and contempt and so forth. Now, the third noble truth. Well, we're not quite ready for that, actually. So by summarizing those two truths, those first two truths, close together like that, the nonsense of suffering may be extremely clear. If there's exactly one way that life is, but then life is not that way, then how can there be exactly one way that life is? There's a problem there. Obviously, a linguistic construction of how life is exactly one way is part of life. In other words, part of life is that there are these possible linguistic constructions of there's exactly one way that life is. Well, that's part of life. Okay? So if there's a logical conflict between a linguistic construction, or also known as a belief, about how life should be, and the actual experience of life how is, then suffering is one of two alternatives. Suffering is neglecting the actuality of life for the nonsense belief in words. The other alternative would be to recognize the nonsense belief in words about how life should be and that there's exactly one way that it is and all that, and drop it, or give attention to the actuality of how life is going on. So in the Judeo-Christian terminology, neglecting the actuality of life by worshiping a nonsense belief in words is referenced. That's what is referenced by placing another God before God. Placing another God before God is worshiping a nonsense belief in words and neglecting the actuality of life. Mark 7:7. In vain they worship me, teaching the traditions of men rather than the commandments of God. That's how it's one of the popular translations. But rather than the way that life's actually happening, rather than how God is actually creating life, they worship some traditions that humans made, like with language and beliefs. There are many other verses, but unless one comes specifically to mind, I'm going to just stick with my own content here, which again is based on the Four Noble Truths, which incidentally are traditionally rooted in Buddhism. So, if there's a logical conflict between a construction or belief about how life should be and the actual experience of how life is, then suffering is neglecting the actuality of how life is to worship the nonsense belief in words. So there's some vanity and foolishness and ignorance. Innocent, we could call it innocent. It's all based on a mistake. It's an innocent mistake, or consider that it might be. Again, back to the references that Jesus traditionally is recognized as making on the cross. They don't even know what they're doing. They don't know. They have no idea what they're doing. They don't know. Let's be merciful about this whole thing. They have no idea. Um, so rather than neglecting the actuality of life, we can look at the actuality of life. So placing another God before God would be uh, worshiping beliefs and traditional beliefs rather than the actuality of how life works, what God is creating, or God's creation. And you don't even really need the terminology of God and creation and all that. It's just how things are going. And I don't mean to say the way it really is. I just know the particular whatever perception is there. We could say whatever is perceived or whatever seems to be rather than the way it is, because interpretation is part of, at least part of language and communication. So in Muslim terminology, they may not use the term placing another god before God. I don't know, maybe they do. But in Muslim terminology, recognizing the actuality of life as distinct from worshiping a nonsense belief made of words. It's like a kind of humility about our perception, as distinct from worshiping a nonsense belief made of words, is what is referenced by there is no God but God. The actuality of life, the perceiving that's going on, that's God, so to speak. And the ideas about God and the language about God, that's not God. Language and labels about God are not God. There's no God but God. There's no word, there's no phrase, there's no prayer that has a monopoly on God. There is no monopoly on God. There's no one right way to describe life. So, of course, because language involves codes, various interpretations of the encoded messages and words of the various scriptures and traditions are possible. Even of everything I'm saying now, anything anybody says, various interpretations are possible. Why? Because we're dealing with encoded messages. They're symbolic. So, worshiping language instead of God is the root of idolatry. It's innocent, but that's what it is. And all the explanations in language and all the other beliefs in language don't touch the basic misunderstanding in language. They're all mistakes until we get the root of language as the issue. Anything that we say is probably just more belief, nonsense stuff based on what should be. And there's exactly one way that life is, and so on. All right. So even the phrase literal interpretation is ironic, because if something is recognized as an interpretation, then interpretation implies the use of symbolic codes of language. So how can there be a literal symbolism? How can there be a literal interpretation? Such idealisms and idolatries are nonsense from the start. Now, people often believe in nonsense. That's basically beliefs. But once the root of the issue is recognized, it's a lot of other issues just fall away. So, nonsense is part of life, just as language is part of life. Should there be no nonsense? Should there be no beliefs made of words? Should there be no words? Should there be exactly one interpretation of anything? No. Those ideas fall back into the same trap of nonsense. It is not that there should be no suffering or no misinterpretations in language that produce ill will and resentment and contempt and so forth, nor that there should be any suffering. Those are just two options. There either is suffering or there is not suffering. That's all. Which reminds me of the Diamond Sutra of Buddhism, which actually says no suffering. No self, no idealism, no belief, all those kind of things. Once you get to not taking all that stuff so seriously, not identifying it as true, then there's no problem. Once there's no, here's the only way that life is, there's no life at all. It's nonsense, but there's no language at all. But that nonsense language points to that clearly explicit nonsense language, or unusual language, points to the language that people so often use that we might call common sense, but it might actually be common nonsense. So the third noble truth of the discontinuing of the cause of suffering is simple. To discontinue causing yourself suffering, simply recognize how you've been causing yourself suffering through the inattentive use of language. That recognizing is sufficient to discontinue the causing of suffering. In other words, suffering does not need to be fixed. Suffering can be distinguished. The distinguishing of suffering results in a relaxing away from the beliefs that cause suffering, that neglect. that worshiping of belief and neglecting of life just falls away once there's a distinguishing of how certain language and a belief in that certain language can produce suffering. Once the beliefs are distinguished as nonsense, no additional beliefs are required to replace the presence of the prior beliefs. It's not to fix those beliefs that are wrong with new beliefs that are right. More beliefs will only bring more suffering. To review again, the first noble truth is that suffering is relating to some part of life as if it should not be how it is. The second noble truth is that suffering originates in the belief that there is exactly one way that a particular part of life is, and that's the only way that it should be. So the linguistic belief that there's only one way that some part of life should be results naturally in relating to one or more parts of life as if they should not be how they are, which is suffering. The linguistic belief that there's only one way that life should be naturally results in relating to life, some parts of life, as if they should not be how they are, because they weren't the ones that were labeled in language as the way it is and the way it should be. And that process is suffering. It doesn't just cause a later suffering. It's like that's the root of suffering, and the different things like grief and resentment and contempt and rage, those are just branches. If you're trying to fix the branches and cut off the branches, it's a very different thing than cutting it at the trunk. So the third noble truth is to discontinue causing yourself suffering by simply recognizing how you've been causing yourself suffering through the inattentive use of language. That language involving should and how it really is and the one way that life is and so forth. Recognizing the power of language naturally results in no longer worshiping any beliefs of language. Once we're really present to the operation of language as language, then beliefs in language as actuality, that ceases. The way it is a construction in language. The way it is isn't the way it is. The way it is a code, it's a symbol, it's a metaphor. It's a saying. It's a construction in language. It's an interpretation. The way it really should be is a construction in language. You will be free of the suffering caused by the inattentive use of language simply by recognizing the power of language. So there's no single way that life should be. There's no single way that anyone should be. There's no single way that I am. There's no single way of labeling life with language that is the only possible interpretation. There's lots of interpretations. All of those constructions in language are nonsense to say that there's only one way of labeling life with language, or that there's only one possible interpretation of life, or that there's only one way that I am and ever will be, or that there's only one way that life should be. That's all nonsense, and it's based on an inattention to the power of language, or a lack of recognition. Once the recognition is present, then the whole network that produces ill will and contempt and shame and guilt and blame, resentment, suffering, it's gone. It's done. All of those constructions in language are nonsense. Most, if not all, are. And no, they're not all nonsense. But all these things about there's only one way that things should be, that's not really true. Many interpretations in language are possible. And let me say a little bit briefly about this idea that there is the functionality of how things should be. If I say, how do you want to go? Which direction do you go to get from Mexico to Canada? I might say, well, you should go north. That's it. There's no problem with that. It's relative. It's in a specific context. Should has a context. It's not that you should go north, that you should want to go from Mexico to Canada. It's that if you want to go from Mexico to Canada, the direction to go to get there most quickly is north. All right. So once we're present to the variety of usages of language, there are sensible or functional uses of language and constructions in language. But there's a whole lot of nonsense, like there's no such thing as language. That's nonsense. If you believe in there's no such thing as language, that's going to be a problem, especially if you're talking a lot. Okay. So if you believe that there's only one way that things should be, or there's only one way that life is, that's going to result in some inefficiency, some suffering, some contempt, some blame and shame and so forth. And those things are pointers back to the Four Noble Truths, back to the power of language, back to an attention to actuality and a distinguishing of what beliefs are. So, as for the fourth noble truth, the way to live life after suffering is basically to be attentive to language. That's it. Do what you must do. Do what you can do. Do what you should do. Do what you will do. Now, there may be other interpretations of these Four Noble Truths. Since these Four Noble Truths are just symbols made of language, why shouldn't there be multiple interpretations? Is there exactly one way that the Four Noble Truths should be? Is there exactly one way that the Four Noble Truths are? Are there exactly four noble truths? Are these noble truths even true? Of course they're noble, but are they true? What if there's no such thing as a noble truth except as a symbol in language? So if someone says attentive to language makes no difference, so what? If someone challenges you with a nonsense belief made of language, so what? If someone says that their nonsense belief made of language is not a nonsense belief made of language, so what? If someone says that idolatry is not idolatry, so what? If someone says that their language is not idolatry, but some other language is idolatry, so what? If someone says that there is no such thing as freedom, so what? If someone says there's no such thing as language, so what? Remember, when nonsense is recognized as nonsense, nonsense cannot cause suffering. It's that inattention and belief in nonsense that produces the experience of suffering. So only believing in nonsense can cause suffering. So one can play along with someone else's beliefs or not. One can use that language without believing it. If someone is speaking the language of suffering, you can speak in that language as well. Yet there is another form of language beyond suffering, or there might be. Also, is there another form of interaction beyond the use of language? That was the Four Noble Truths, including life after suffering and how suffering is related to life as if some part of life should not be how it is, and how thinking that there's exactly one way that life is the root or cause of suffering, and how discontinuing a belief in that language discontinues suffering. Discontinues the suffering of neglecting actuality of what's available for giving attention to those beliefs. There's nothing wrong with giving attention to beliefs. There's nothing wrong with believing nonsense. There's just another alternative. There's nothing wrong with suffering. It's not that suffering shouldn't be. There's just another alternative.